are big fans of survival horror here at Team Triple Jump, and we're always on the lookout for a spooky game to get our pulses racing. We often cover the genre in our top 10 lists as well, though sometimes it does feel like we go over the same ground quite often. Indeed, when you think survival horror, your mind probably goes straight to Resident Evil and Silent Hill, but honestly, we've talked about them so much we could probably write a book on the subject. Actually, our writer Philip did write a book about Resident Evil, and it's really good. You should check it out. For today's list, we've decided that it's high time that some other fantastic horror titles had their moment in the sun. Survival horror itself is quite a difficult beast to define though, so if a game has a claustrophobic atmosphere, minimal resources, sparse checkpoints and terrifying enemies, it's welcome here. I'm that one girl you don't want to meet while trapped in a creepy gothic mansion, Ashton from Triple Jump, and here are 10 brilliant survival horror games that aren't Resident Evil or Silent Hill. Number 10, The Evil Within. We're kicking off this list with The Evil Within, the 2014 survival horror developed by Tango Gameworks, published by Bethesda Softworks, and directed by Shinji Mikami, who coincidentally also directed the first Resident Evil game. Small world, huh? The game follows protagonist, Detective Sergeant Sebastian Castellanos, as he and his partner Joseph and junior detective Julie investigate a mass murder at the Beacon Mental Hospital. Things quickly take a turn for the supernatural, however, and the group finds themselves separated and hunted by an asylum full of monsters hell-bent on murdering them in horrific ways. If players have any hopes of surviving the ordeal, they'll need to use their brains. Resources can be scavenged, but they're also quite scarce, so it's important to think carefully before deciding to fight. Even if you do get the jump on an enemy, they may not stay down for long. Often it's better to run and hide or use the environment to draw enemies away from your position so that you can make a quick getaway. The Evil Within is a terrifying take on the genre, plunging players into a chillingly tense and atmospheric world filled with a vast array of characters that are sure to keep you awake at night. Number 9, Dead Space. If you're looking for a survival horror title that's out of this world, both figuratively and literally, then look no further than 2008's Dead Space. Developed by EA Redwood Shores and published by EA, Dead Space transports players to the year 2508, by which time humanity's broken free of the confines of Earth and spread itself across the galaxy. The game is set on a mining spaceship overrun by undead monsters known as necromorphs, and protagonist Isaac Clarke must traverse the ship in order to solve puzzles and find supplies. Not only that, but he must also deal with the effects of his increasing psychosis, which range from paranoia to hallucinations, meaning we can never be sure what's real and what isn't. Upon its release, Dead Space received critical acclaim, with some reviewers going as far as to call it the best survival horror game since Resident Evil 4. Thanks to some brilliant visual and sound design, Dead Space is massively tense and atmospheric, while its story and well-acted characters keep players coming back for more. Can't get enough of sci-fi spookums? Well, lucky for you, Dead Space was so successful it spawned 2 decent sequels, and it's getting a remake in 2022. Number 8, Darkwood. You might not think that a top-down game would be particularly spooky, and yet 2017's Darkwood manages it. The game begins with the player character slumped over a desk in their house. As they explore, more rooms are revealed, though the character muses that some doors are best if they remain locked. It transpires that this individual is a doctor, and that he is trapped inside of a forest that allows its inhabitants no means of escape. To make matters worse, a plague ravages any survivors, causing its victims to transform into monstrous abominations. Whilst exploring the local area, the doctor finds another person, and surmising that the stranger might know a way out of the forest, takes him back to his house, and gives him a cup of tea and a slice of cake. Definitely, nothing bad happens. Because of its top-down perspective, players can see a decent amount of their surroundings, but Darkwood's field of vision mechanics prevents them from knowing what's lurking when they're not looking. What the game absolutely nails though is its atmosphere. The whole thing feels oppressively claustrophobic thanks to some impressive audio and visuals. Trust me when I say, you'll never look at trees the same way again. Number 7, Siren. If you like your survival horror with a sprinkle of innovation, then you can do worse than to try your hands at 2003's Siren, or Forbidden Siren if you want to get PAL about this. The game weaves the story of 10 interconnected survivors of a supernatural disaster, and plays out in stages, each focusing on a different character. So it's up to players to help the survivors escape and figure out exactly what's going on. Now, full transparency here, not all critics were completely taken with Siren. The game is quite difficult and some of the puzzles rely on trial and error rather than logic. With that said though, Siren is definitely worth your time. Players will also enjoy the sight-jacking mechanic, which allows characters to see or hear through the eyes and ears of other people nearby. This not only helps to track the location of other characters, but also allows the player to see what they're up to and whether there are any items in the area that are worth having. Sure, the voice acting is a little wonky and the graphics definitely show their age, but there's still an awful lot of spooky fun to be had with Siren. Number 6, Fatal Frame 2, Crimson Butterfly. Over the years, we've seen all kinds of items utilised as weapons in video games, and it seems like, in the right hands, anything can be means to dispatch enemies, even a camera. The core gameplay mechanic of 2003's Fatal Frame 2 Crimson Butterfly sees players using a special camera imbued with the power of exorcism to take down the sinister ghosts and spirits that torment twin sisters Mio and Mayu. Whilst visiting their childhood stomping ground, the twins discover a strange village. Though on first glance it seems abandoned, it transpires that the village is populated by the souls of the dead. Mayu is possessed, and it's up to Miyu to save her from ritual sacrifice at the hands of angry spirits. The camera mechanic is a refreshing take on combat in a survival horror setting. Unlike Silent Hill or Resident Evil, where you're purely focused on beating the living daylights out of a creature, Fatal Frame 2 tasks players with destroying their enemies in a more spiritual sense. Not only does it have an interesting central premise, but Fatal Frame 2 also has a fantastic story, spooky atmosphere, and challenging puzzles to keep players hooked from beginning to end. Number 5, Dino Crisis. Have you ever sat down to play Resident Evil and thought to yourself, this is fine, but it would be a lot better if there were some dinosaurs? You're not the only one, and even Mr. Resident Evil himself, Shinji Mikami, thought that his magnum opus needed a little more Jurassic flair. The team behind the adventures of Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine gave birth to Dino Crisis, a game that's brilliant and scary in equal measure. The game's story follows Regina, an agent sent by the Secret Operation Raid team, as she and other members of her squad embark on a mission to capture Dr. Edward Kirk, whom SWORD believes is engineering weapons. They're not wrong, though the weapons in question are less of the conventional variety and more reptilian in nature. Naturally, by the time the team makes it to the island, the facility is swarming with dinosaurs, and it's up to the player to help get Regina out in one piece. Many outlets described Dino Crisis as Resident Evil with dinosaurs, but although the game shares an awful lot of its gameplay mechanics with its zombified predecessors, it ramps up the fear factor through modernised environments and smart AI. If you've ever wished that Jurassic Park had gone all in with the horror, then Dino Crisis is the game for you. Number 4, Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth. You can't talk about great horror without giving a nod to one of the best horror writers of all time. Though he may have been dead for almost a century, the work of H.P. Lovecraft continues to influence authors, filmmakers, and even game developers to this day. Call of Cthulhu, Dark Corners of the Earth is an adaptation of Lovecraft's novella, The Shadow over Innsmouth. The game follows private investigator Jack Walters as he travels to the coastal town of Innsmouth to investigate the disappearance of one of its residents. All is not well, however, as Jack soon finds himself the target of the town's corrupt police force and murderous cult. As though that doesn't make for enough of a bad day at the office, the town is also home to a bunch of eldritch horrors, including Cthulhu himself. Dark Corners of the Earth is by no means a walk in the park, and players will need to strategize carefully. As with most survival horrors, supplies are limited, so the guns blazing approach is seldom a good idea. They'll also need to keep a close eye on their own sanity, as looking upon the nightmarish creatures for too long will push Jack closer to the edge, and no one wants that in the midst of a supernatural disaster, do they? Number 3, Alone in the Dark. If your only experience of Alone in the Dark is the atrocity that was Uwe Boll's film adaptation of the title, then you might be wondering what it's doing on this list. We'd like to assure you, though, that the original Alone in the Dark video game from 1992 is indeed a triumph of the survival horror genre, and not just a cheesy action romp. The year is 1924, and renowned artist Jeremy Hartwood has committed suicide. The whole thing seems a bit sus, considering that Hartwood's mansion is believed to be haunted, but the investigation is wrapped up quickly and soon forgotten. Players can take on the role of either Edward Carnby, a private investigator looking for a piano on behalf of an antique stealer, or Hartwood's niece, Emily, who is also seeking the piano, but instead hopes to find the clues within it pertaining to why her uncle has killed himself. The characters start out in the mansion's attic and must escape without falling foul of many supernatural creatures that inhabit it. Though these days Alone in the Dark is showing signs of age, at the time of its release it was the pinnacle of horror gaming, perfectly balancing story and atmosphere with mind-boggling puzzles and gameplay elements that have become a staple of the genre. Number 2, Amnesia: The Dark Descent. You know, I could swear I had a survival horror title to recommend in number 2 spot, but I've just completely forgotten what it was. Just kidding. Bit of amnesia humour for you there. First released in 2010, Amnesia: The Dark Descent tells the story of Daniel, a man who awakens in a castle with no memory for who he is, aside from his own name, or where he came from. Shortly after awakening, he finds a note that he has written for himself, which informs him that he's being hunted by a shadow, and that he needs to descend into the castle's inner sanctum in order to kill the Baron Alexander. Unlike many survival horror titles, Amnesia: The Dark Descent gives players no means to fight back against the disfigured entities that roam the halls of the castle. The only choices they have are to run and hide. What's more is that catching too many sightings of the terrifying monsters will cause Daniel's sanity meter to deplete, rendering him incapable of proper movement at best, and death at worst. Don't think that hiding in a dark cupboard will do you any good either, as spending too much time out of the light will also drive Daniel insane. Gosh, he's really quite useless, isn't he? And number 1, System Shock 2. You've got to feel a bit for the System Shock series. After all, the games were an inspiration for BioShock, one of the greatest games ever made, and yet they always seem to get overlooked. Heck, even we're guilty of giving survival horror gem System Shock 2 the cold shoulder in favour of Rapture's finest, so we reckon it's about high time it got the recognition it deserves. The game is set aboard a starship in the year 2114, where players are charged with trying to stem an outbreak of an infection that's devastated the ship. Along the way, they're contacted by the Many, a hive mind which seek to indoctrinate them, and Shodan, a malevolent AI and the game's main antagonist. In addition to its survival horror elements, System Shock 2 also features some RPG mechanics, meaning the players can approach the game in a variety of ways. Although the story and enemies stay the same, they can have an entirely different experience on every playthrough. Regardless of how they build their protagonist, however, what's assured is a hugely tense environment, a superbly crafted story, and an antagonist that will get right under your skin and stay there for a long time after the game is over.